Hello everybody. We're going to continue on now with some additional physiology topics for Unit 2. These are some basic important topics about very basic functions in the human body, and we're going to go ahead and weave them into Unit 2 here because these are things that are going to come up throughout your anatomy and physiology coursework, and some of these are things that you can almost go, they're so fundamental to how the human body works that they're often at the root of explanations for how and why things are working in a particular way in some of the future body systems you're going to be studying. So we are going to go ahead and talk about some of these things here. And one of those, I want to talk to you more about body fluids, and we need to think about body fluids. Body fluids are kind of important. All of your cells are surrounded by them. And of course, we've talked before about how the fluid in your blood has to transport all of the important solutes to your cells so that they have the things that they need to be able to function. And you've also got to transport away the wastes that cells in our body generate, because those can't build up. They would be toxic. So body fluids are very, very, very important and vital for our continued ability to function and stay alive. All right, we've talked a little bit about this before, but your body is divided up into what we can call fluid compartments. All right, and so now if you look here, the average person, the average adult, has about 40 liters of total body water. All of the water molecules in your body, if you could pool them all together, that would be about 40 liters. So that's about 22-liter bottles of some sort of soda that you're going to drink. Makes up about 60% of your body weight. Now, interestingly, most of your body water is actually in the intracellular fluid. And remember, before we've talked about how we can abbreviate that as ICF. So that's any fluid that's enclosed by the plasma membrane of a cell is going to be intracellular fluid. So in a typical adult, that's about 25 liters inside your cells. All right, so then everything else, all of the other fluid in your body that's outside of cells, can be classified as ECF. We've talked about that before. Extracellular fluid, that's about 15 liters, in an average adult. And then you have different types of extracellular fluid. There are different compartments, different places where fluids exist outside of the boundaries of your cells. And most of that extracellular fluid exists as what we call interstitial fluid, or IF. So ICF means intracellular fluid, IF means interstitial fluid. Those are the fluids that are bathing the cells in your tissues. And then another significant part of it exists as plasma. Plasma is the fluid portion of your blood. We can also think of that as the extracellular matrix of our blood, because blood is a connective type of tissue. Here's another way of looking at this as well. So again, intracellular fluids, or ICF, make up about 40% of your body weight. Extracellular fluids make up about 20% of your body weight. And also what they're trying to show you here in this diagram, I kind of like this diagram because they're trying to emphasize to you that fluids move between these different compartments, these different locations in the body. So if you kind of follow along over here, they're showing you, all right, where do you absorb most of your body water? Most of that is going to come in through the intestinal tract, as they're showing you over here. All right, so the small intestine is an organ. The walls of your organs actually have blood vessels inside the walls that can be extremely tiny vessels, but there are blood vessels in there. So when you absorb water out of the inside of your intestinal tract, it gets transferred into the blood. The blood then carries it to various tissues, like they're showing you over here, like the skin, the lungs, the kidneys, etc. All right, so then that fluid actually moves out of the blood vessels. It comes out of the blood vessels and gets into your tissues, And so now that fluid is part of your interstitial fluids, or IF. And then fluids in the IF, remember osmosis, water moves across plasma membranes by osmosis. So that's where your cells get their water from. They take up water from the IF. Their water comes from over here. Where does the IF come from? The IF, the water in your IF, is coming from the blood. Where does the blood get its water? It absorbs it from the inside. Most of it anyway, it absorbs from the inside of the small intestine. So your fluids are able to move through all these compartments. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to stay hydrated. All right, some additional, let's think a little bit more about extracellular fluid. So we already said most of your extracellular fluid is IF. Now some sources will include your lymph as part of the IF. Lymph is the fluid inside your lymphatic vessels. As we mentioned a little bit in Unit 1, your lymphatic vessels drain excess tissue fluids, or these interstitial fluids, out of your tissues and return it to the blood to conserve the fluid. And so some sources will just classify lymph as IF. It's just IF that's kind of draining through these little drainage ditches on its way back to your blood. And we have blood plasma. That's a type of extracellular fluid. But what about some of these other fluids we've heard about already this semester? The serous fluids inside your peritoneal cavity, your pleural cavities, and your pericardial cavity. That's a type of extracellular fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, is an abbreviation for that. That's the fluid that bathes your brain and your spinal cord. That's a type of extracellular fluid. The ocular fluids, what's the ocular, what does that refer to? The eyes. So that's the jelly-like fluid inside your eyeballs. Gastrointestinal secretions, like when your stomach secretes acidic fluid to help you with digestion, the acid fluids to help you start some of the processes of digestion. That's a type of extracellular fluid. Urine that you're storing is a type of extracellular fluid, and saliva is also a type of extracellular fluid as well. So those all fall into this ECF category over here. They're just present in lower volumes. And the same story is in effect for those as well, like your serous fluids and your peritoneal cavity, pleural cavities, pericardial cavity. That is coming out of the blood, and it moves into the very thin tissues of those serous membranes within that lining, and then it's going to move from the lining on into those cavities to fill up the cavities with those fluids. So in that case, the fluid is moving between compartments just like it does elsewhere in the body. All right, returning here, here's our generic connective tissue diagram we've seen before, and more specifically, this is supposed to be a diagram of areolar type loose connective tissue. So again, any of these cells you see on here, remember this is a macrophage, this is a fibroblast, that's an example of a white blood cell. There's a mast cell, adipocyte. All of those are cells, so the fluid inside those is classified as ICF. And then all these spaces you see in here running around, all these protein fibers, the collagen fibers, the elastic fibers, etc., that is going to be your IF in that tissue, your interstitial fluid, which is a type of ECF. All right, and as we've noted before on this little diagram right in here, you've got this little red blood vessel. That is a very tiny microscopic blood vessel. We call it capillary. And so capillaries, these microscopic blood vessels, are what actually deliver the water to your tissues, no matter where they're located. So water is going to move out. It's in here in the capillaries. It's going to move out and become part of the interstitial fluids. And then by osmosis, if the cells need to, water moves back and forth across plasma membranes anyway, so we won't say if and when they need to. but water will move from these interstitial fluids into those cells by osmosis. So by doing that, water is moving between these compartments. Also, water can move back into the blood from your interstitial fluid, so it's a back and forth type thing. Water and intracellular fluid by osmosis can flow out into the interstitial fluids, and then it can flow from there back into the bloodstream. So fluids move between compartments. Now, what makes that happen? Why does that occur? All right. So here we've got another little generic, this is a very, very basic diagram of fluid flow within the body. But all right, so up here this is supposed to be a blood vessel with plasma in it. So we've got water molecules flowing through here. Now, why do they move out? All right, so when you have the thinnest blood vessels that we call capillaries, the walls of a capillary are just one cell thick. They're actually squamous epithelial cells. So the walls are a simple squamous epithelium. And you actually have little slits between the cells, little spaces there. So how does water get out? Well, your blood has blood pressure, and that blood pressure is necessary for circulating the blood throughout your body. Blood pressure is a type of what we call hydrostatic pressure, or you can think about that as like water pressure. If a blood vessel was a garden hose, you know how if you squeeze the walls of the garden hose, it forces the water to move through more quickly. You're applying that pressure. That's a type of hydrostatic pressure. So a lot of times we think about hydrostatic pressure squeezing or pushing fluids around in the body. So your blood pressure is an example of that, and it's that blood pressure, a type of hydrostatic pressure, which actually helps force fluids out of the plasma and into the interstitial fluids. So we think about hydrostatic pressure pushing. It'll actually push fluids in between those cells. Now the cells in the lining there of the capillary can actually take up water by osmosis, and by osmosis water will pass through those cells and over into the interstitial fluids as well. All right, so then you have water out here in your interstitial fluids, and we've talked before about how water molecules by osmosis can move across the plasma membranes of our cells. All right, so that's determined by your solute concentrations, as we talked about during Unit 1. So if you have a greater solute concentration inside your cells than in the interstitial fluids, that's going to tend to suck water in. Water is going to follow those solutes. If you have a greater concentration of solutes in your interstitial fluids outside your cells, those solutes are going to suck water out of the cells. Water is going to follow those solutes. So it's convenient to think about osmotic pressure. That's this pressure that solutes exert on water. It's a sucking type of pressure. Osmotic pressure sucks water across the plasma membranes of our cells and toward areas where you have a greater solute concentration. All right, and some other examples of fluid movement they're showing you here. All right, so notice we've got an arrow going from our interstitial fluids back into the blood. You'll learn in Biology 202 that's actually a type of osmotic pressure. You have a greater solute concentration here in your plasma, and that helps suck some water back out of your tissues and into the bloodstream so that your bloodstream doesn't lose all of its water to your tissues. There's a balance that keeps your blood filled with fluid and your tissues filled with fluid as well. There's a nice sweet spot with that and how all that works. You'll learn about that in your next A&P course. Transcellular fluids, here that term, don't worry so much about that. An example of transcellular fluid is the serous fluids within your within the cavities, within your major body cavities, or the cerebrospinal fluid around the brain and the spinal cord. And those types of compartments do have a lining that's built from cells. And so fluid will move across those linings by moving into or out of the cells by osmosis. So you can have this osmosis sucking pressure that's moving fluids from one compartment to another. Your lymphatic vessels that you have in your tissues, like they're showing you here, which drain excess tissue fluids, it's actually, you have hydrostatic pressure, this squeezing, pushing pressure in your tissues themselves that force some of that fluid into the lymph vessels, and then the lymph vessels are going to carry that back to the bloodstream. So in a nutshell, kind of your take home here is I just want you guys thinking about the fact that fluids move between these compartments in your body, and that movement is dictated by two types of pressure. We have this squeezing or pushing pressure called hydrostatic pressure, like your blood pressure. You keep your blood vessels pressurized, that'll push fluids out when needed. And osmotic pressure is a sucking pressure. The solutes, wherever they're more concentrated, will wind up sucking water molecules in greater numbers across plasma membranes, either inside or out of cells, depending on what your needs are, or depending on those solute concentrations. All right, let's take a closer look at that, and how these solute concentrations can affect your cells. We've talked a little bit about this before, but it doesn't hurt to review it again, because osmotic pressure is such a crucial topic for anatomy and physiology students, and on into your health science professional courses as well. All right, when you become dehydrated, or let's say you're excessively hydrated, how does that affect your fluid compartments and your cells? So in this diagram from your textbook, it's actually from one of the chapters toward the back, where they're discussing fluid balance in more detail. All right, let's say you're dehydrated. Okay, you've been working outside on a very hot day, you've been sweating, you excrete water in your sweat, you have lesser amounts of solutes in your sweat. So when you sweat, a lot of times you lose more water than solutes from your extracellular fluids. So what's going to happen in that case? If you're sweating, you're dehydrating, you're losing water, but you're not losing as many solutes, what's going to happen to your ECF? Your ECF is going to become hypotonic or hypertonic. All right, hopefully you said hypertonic, because you've lost water but not solutes. So your solute concentration is higher in those fluids. And then what did we say? About our intracellular fluids? Or what did we learn before about our cells? When our cells are surrounded by hypertonic fluids, those solutes in there are going to suck the water out of the cells. So water is going to tend to move in that direction out of the cells. What will happen to your cells? They're going to shrivel. If they shrivel enough, if they lose enough water, they're not going to be able to function properly. They're not maintaining a stable internal environment, and they're not going to be able to do all their cell things as well as they're supposed to do. Now, how about overhydration or excess hydration? Or some people call this hypotonic hydration, like you see there in the legend of that figure. Let's say you take in tons and tons and tons and tons of water, but you're not really replacing your solutes, you're not eating anything, you're not drinking something like Gatorade that has electrolytes in it, and so you take up excess water. Your extracellular fluids in that case become hypotonic, which means your solutes are more diluted out here compared to in here. Water follows solutes. Water is going to get sucked into the cells due to that osmotic pressure. It's going to move that way, and what will happen to your cells? The cells are going to swell. And now this is going to be happening across your whole body at once. If you think about the sizes of your body cavities and the amount of space between major organs and the linings or the edges of those body cavities, can you think about a critical organ that probably doesn't have a whole lot of room to swell? I can think of one, and in fact, In cases when people do become overhydrated, they have hypotonic overhydration like this, the problem is the brain swells so much that the brain can become damaged and it can actually kill you. All right, a little bit more about our fluid balance here. Fluid balance, that all that refers to is water in must equal water out. All right, so we said we need about 40 liters of body fluid in an average adult. And on a daily basis, we need to take in about 2,500 milliliters of water. That's 2.5 liters. And if we're achieving proper fluid balance in our bodies, we're going to lose 2.5 liters of body fluid as well. Water in should equal water out. What are the sources of water in? Beverages that we drink, about 60%. The foods that we eat are moist. They have water in them, so we actually get about 30% of our water that way. And this 10% from metabolism, our bodies actually generate their own water through the cellular respiration processes. We'll be seeing that shortly on the next video lecture clip. But believe it or not, we actually make about 10% of our own water. We actually convert the oxygen gas that we breathe in from the air into water molecules, believe it or not. All right, water out. How do we lose water? About 60% per day from urine. That makes sense. When we were learning about the skin, we said that our eccrine sweat glands, we lose about 500 milliliters of water a day through insensible perspiration. We don't even realize that's happening, but it's functioning and helping us cool our bodies. You also breathe out water vapor from your lungs. You exhale out water as well. So we have an insensible type loss that way because we don't realize that's happening. You've seen that before when you exhale on a cold day and that water that you're exhaling condenses in the air and forms fog from you breathing into the cold air. Okay, other types of sweating, and I'm going to assume there that 8% sweating there would be additional sweating on top of the insensible sweating that we do, like if you get overheated. And then about 4% water loss in your feces. And I just want to reiterate again with you briefly about this movement of your body fluids and the solutes inside them between compartments. This is a really good thing for you to develop a grasp for here early during the semester. So what they're showing you here in this diagram is how your body fluids transport important solutes around. For example, they're showing you here O2, oxygen gas, enters the lungs inside little tiny air sacs, and O2 molecules are very small. They'll diffuse out of the air and into surrounding little tiny blood vessels around those air sacs. By doing that, it then is in your blood plasma. Blood vessels bring that to all of your tissues, so the O2 can then move out of the blood and into the interstitial fluids, and then O2 can diffuse into your cells out of those interstitial fluids. How about the CO2 waste? CO2 is a waste that your cells generate due to metabolism. That's going to diffuse out of cells and into interstitial fluids. It winds up diffusing into your blood plasma. The blood circulates back to the lungs, and CO2 as a waste, it's a gas, diffuses out of your blood and into the air in your lungs so that you can exhale it out. So this fluid movement throughout the body and the ability of things to move between these compartments is critical for transporting solutes around. Very, very important. How about over here? Gastrointestinal tract. You absorb nutrients from the foods, water and ions as well. Those are going to get absorbed into the blood vessels. I wish they weren't showing the stomach there, because the stomach is not actually where most of your nutrients get absorbed. They get absorbed in the small intestine. They enter the blood within the walls of the wall of the small intestine. Blood takes them to tissues. They get pushed out of the blood and into the interstitial fluids, and then your cells can take up those nutrients. Most of them are going to move through passive transport or active transport, depending on the needs of your cells. Water movement, they're showing you here. Water moves back and forth across cell membranes, as they're showing you. Water moves back and forth between the blood and interstitial fluids. Water can move back and forth between the blood and your gastrointestinal tract. Same thing with the kidneys over here. You have various ions that are important for your bodily function that are present here in your interstitial fluids. You have nitrogenous wastes, nitrogen-containing wastes. Those are waste molecules that come from amino acids and nucleotides or nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. As they get broken down, that generates what we call nitrogenous waste. So your cells are making those. They're going to move across the plasma membrane. The cell's going to either pump them out or let them diffuse out through carrier or channel proteins. Then they're going to wind up moving. They're going to be sucked into the blood and enter the blood. The blood will take them to the kidneys, because that's where the kidneys make urine, and so they actually get filtered out of the blood and into the developing urine fluids in your kidney, so that you can excrete those wastes when you're peeing in the bathroom. All right, so you have the movement of these fluids. It's not just about water. This is also the way that your important solutes get transported around in your body. This last little slide here, we're not going to get too heavy duty into this, because this is going to come up when we get to Unit 4. We talk about the muscular system. We'll be revisiting this. But we've talked before about how we have discussed before. All right, if you got a cell here, you got your ICF. It's surrounded by interstitial fluids, which are a type of ECF. All right, so ideally, you want your ECF to be isotonic to the ICF. You want your solute concentrations in intracellular fluids and extracellular fluids to be the same. That way, water's moving back and forth across plasma membranes, but you're not taking up more than you're losing. You're not losing more than you're taking up. Everything stays nice and hunky-dory with your cells. All right, now that does not mean we have the exact same solutes inside our cells as outside our cells. That's absolutely not the case. When we're thinking about isotonic solutions, we just mean the overall solute concentration inside and outside of the cell needs to be the same. The solutes themselves can be different. That's what this graph over here is showing you. It is making a comparison in red. The red bars there are showing you the typical concentrations of particular solutes in the blood. In blue, that's your interstitial fluids, and then in yellow, your intracellular fluids. So if you notice here, for example, sodium ions here, you have a much greater concentration of sodium ions in blood and interstitial fluids than you do inside your cells. Huge difference. And then the reverse is true over here for potassium. All right, you've got a high concentration of potassium ions inside your cells. You've got much lower concentrations of potassium ions outside your cells. And you can look at the graph there to see some of the other differences that you would expect between intracellular and extracellular fluids and particular solutes. The sodium-potassium thing is going to wind up coming back up when we cover the muscular system and the nervous systems, because that is absolutely critical in order for the electrical signaling that takes place within your nervous system and between your nervous system and your skeletal muscles and glands and so forth. Absolutely dependent upon those differences in sodium and potassium concentrations between the intracellular and extracellular compartments. So believe it or not, we will be revisiting this again. But again, if you totaled up all of these different types of solutes and consider their concentrations as a big group, they would be the same inside and outside the cell, even though there are individual differences between those two compartments when you're thinking about just one particular kind of solute. Okay, so that was just a little overview with some additional information about intracellular and extracellular fluids. Info you want to keep thinking about as we move forward in your, or as you move forward in your A&P classes. The next topic we're going to cover will be cellular respiration. That's the processes by which cells break down nutrients to harness the energy that they need to be able to function and power things that they need to do.